Okay, so is Q a government-sanctioned disclosure effort? Yes and no. It depends on the expectations that come when we frame it that way. So there's two things that we can name here that will help clarify what's going on. First, you can look at it as the QAnon disclosures, and then there's the QAnon operation. So the disclosures are an asset. They are a facet of this operation, and they are being used very tactically. So this is not necessarily the government deciding we are going to finally disclose, but instead, it's actually an operation that is so essentially focused on taking down the deep state that it has found a way to use disclosures on a public forum as part of that takedown. So it's extremely tactical, the way disclosure is being used in this massive and highly complex operation. So we want to look at a couple of things that Q has said that help drive home the nature of the disclosures that are built into this operation and what the rest of the operation really looks like. So first, Q has always said that the world is watching. And this has been restated and rephrased in a couple other ways, but the essential point is that there's a number of different parties that are observing the drops. Every time Q drops different information or Q is conversing with a researcher, this is being watched by the researchers, the Anons on the boards. It's being watched by the growing community of Q followers. It's being watched by the different divisions of the Q operation, right? They're watching every drop so that they can get their marching orders and their operational parameters, their different ways of responding to what's occurring in and around the operation. But then finally, it means that the deep state is watching. It means that deep state surveillance is heavily activated and highly focused on the Q operation. So the world is watching lets us know that every time Q puts anything on the boards, it considers all these different parties observing, and so the operation necessarily considers the impact each drop is going to have on all these different players. The next thing we can look at is the statement, no private comms. So Q has said this again and again, and it's been a good way to debunk some of the people claiming to be part of the Q team, but it does something bigger. What it tells us is that there's no private channels of communication in this operation whatsoever. Now, this is a pretty incredible statement because it means that not only is this public forum being used to communicate disclosures to people about the deep state takedown, but it also means that all the divisions of the Q team are only being communicated to via this public forum. And we see this sometimes with some of the coded drops that really don't make any sense to us, that are clearly meant for a division of the Q team. But then the final thing that it means is that that there's no other way that they are communicating with the deep state. They're not sending any secret messages. There's no backdoor communications. It's really just no private communication channels whatsoever. Everything goes through the chans. So again, this brings us to this idea that everything that Q is disclosing and everything that Q is dropping, it has to consider all the different parties involved because it's this singular choice to communicate in this one forum. We have to understand the multifaceted, multidimensional nature then of each drop. Especially important is the impact each drop is looking to have on the deep state as they react to the operation itself. So one of the biggest things to consider then is, of course, disinformation. And Q has stated a number of times that disinformation is necessary. So we have this incredible operation that is disclosing to the public while misleading and posturing towards the deep state, keeping them on their heels, keeping them on the defensive, but still managing to get massive disclosures out to a growing portion of the population. So if we keep in mind that the core goal of this operation is to take down the deep state, then we can observe what's occurring with the drops with that understanding that that is an operational parameter, that everything is sort of tinted by in terms of what Q is putting out there. And we can see this not only in the drops, the formal drops that Q creates, that are the questions and all the connections laid out, but we have to consider this even when Q is conversing in a sort of conversational way with the researchers. That even when Q is going back and forth with these researchers in a colloquial way, it would still necessarily have to pass through these operational parameters, knowing that the deep state is surveilling everything that is being said between Q and these researchers, and knowing that sometimes this might even be a means of the Q team communicating with different divisions. It might seem like something colloquial is occurring between Q and some researchers, but this still may be another coded level of the operation. We can only speculate. Okay, so what is Donald Trump's role in regards to Q? A lot of people want to speculate. They promote the idea that Trump is Q, and this really just can't be the case. So the actual scenario, it ends up being that Trump is obviously involved, obviously aware, but is an asset, is working closely with the Q team and the divisions, and is playing a really big role in this. So there's a lot of different reasons for Trump to be an important asset in this operation. We can look back to Trump's positioning as a presidential candidate, that this was something that was considered by these military and intelligence alliance members, that Trump was essentially, he was profiled and understood, and then he was selected as someone who was a viable candidate to win, but who was not part of the deep state. So we want to look at what kind of qualities he had in addition to his disassociation from the deep state. So he was someone that had his own wealth that was not gained through the kind of corruption that the deep state utilizes. He was someone that had a relative amount of popularity already. But there's a more interesting aspect to this that we can observe, is that Trump obviously has triggered something for the deep state, right? I mean, in terms of winning the election when they never thought Hillary would lose, certainly. But there's kind of a quality to Trump, and I'm sure this was something that was considered in the profiling of the deep state and the profiling of Trump as a candidate, that he has triggered them to obsessively and constantly pour so much of their energy and assets into attacking him. So what this has done is it's outed deep state assets. It's now really clear in the picture that is unfolding within the media and within the sort of mental environment, who some of these deep state operators are. They have had to out themselves to stick to the narrative, the anti-Trump narrative. So by putting him in this position, or by supporting him in winning democratically the presidency, then what we find is the deep state goes into this panic, and they start revealing not only assets they have in the media, the mainstream media, but assets they have in the alternative media. They start revealing channels of communication, because you have this NSA surveillance aspect to Q that is so incredible in its scope, that anytime they trigger the deep state into one of these sort of panicked reactions, then all that surveillance really, really pays off. So that's one of the interesting ways to look at Trump's position within the operation. He's kind of like a master troll in a lot of ways. But the other connection that I think links Trump into disclosure, and more into the full disclosure aspect, so going a little bit outside the realm of Q's disclosures and into some of the free energy and the healing technologies that have been suppressed. So we have this interesting connection with Trump's uncle, I believe is John G. Trump. So he was part of an FBI operation that, after Nikola Tesla died, came in and took all of his materials and was tasked with analyzing and understanding all of Tesla's materials, which were then, of course, classified. But we know that this was something that Trump and his uncle would speak about, that sometimes his uncle would sort of use his classified knowledge base to postulate about what kind of technologies were going to come out in the future, what kind of weapons might be available. So we know that Trump and his uncle had these conversations. So this is something that's in his family. And we know that almost 6,000 patents have been suppressed through the notion that they are a danger to national security, and that the majority of these patents are free energy and healing technologies. So you have this connection with Trump and some of those disclosures, and that gives credence to some of the testimony and some of the speculation that Trump has actually already given classified orders to begin the process of releasing some of these suppressed technologies. So his position within this is multifaceted, but of course for many, the media landscape makes it impossible to observe Trump without any kind of bias. But I'm sure that that will have to change eventually. Yeah. So how does QAnon relate to full disclosure? How do we relate this limited series of disclosures that are very specific, very tactical, very curated towards a specific purpose? How do we bring that into the realm of full disclosure with things like free energy, with things like the secret space program and the extraterrestrial presence, sort of presently and within human history? So what's interesting in terms of the effectiveness of the QAnon disclosures is that their tactical limitations are what have allowed them to be more effective. So I think it's important to look at what had to precede the QAnon operation, right? The amount of surveillance, intelligence gathering, and analysis that needed to occur for an operation like this to exist is massive in scope, because it means that the surveillance and analysis and intelligence gathering of the deep state had to occur. There had to be an understanding of all of their different operations, how they implement false flags, what their channels of communication are, what coding systems they use, how do they fund themselves, how do they move money that is illegal, how do they operate massive human trafficking rings, what are their religious preferences. All of this had to be carefully gathered and understood for the current QAnon operation to occur. But what's also interesting is that knowing they were going to be disclosing to the public and to this specific cross-section of the public, the people that are already on 8chan and 4chan, digging into conspiracy theories, and then some of the truther communities that operate in orbit to some of that work, and then some of the people in the public who might be ready for this information but just need to be guided in the process of exploring it themselves. So it means that all those different groups, that this operation must have had psychological profiles and analysis and surveillance on these groups as well, to be able to cater the disclosures in such a way as to reach the maximum number of people. So there's this paradox here for looking at full disclosure, that in limiting their disclosures, they actually reached more people. So the challenge of full disclosure then, it becomes about honoring this call for total transparency, but doing it tactically, right? And understanding how much work went into getting the QAnon movement to grow this way. And that giving people just a series of questions that they then have to go and use to research and wake themselves up is much more powerful than trying to force someone to believe something that exists outside their paradigm. So this actual tactic is very important if we want to be bringing more people into a comprehension of the secret space program, of these free energy technologies, of this history we have with the cosmic neighborhood around us. So we want to be able to understand our enemy, right? The extent to which Q exemplifies knowing your enemy is very, very important. But then also knowing your audience, knowing your target market. If we're really looking to disclose more information, then we have to be sensitive to what is going to land for which people. So I think that the tactical nature of it is really, really important. And thinking about the fact that so much work preceded this operation that we then have to look into the past, because some of this is more than just the NSA's current incredible surveillance technology. This is also the fact that this is a secret civil and international war that has been raging quietly for decades. So we have this history leading up to this. We have JFK's assassination and what that meant for an alliance that had realized that there was a coup underway in America. And the blow that JFK's assassination really was for that alliance. And then we have this whole narrative leading up to the decision to support Trump's presidency and then implement these public drops and bring us to where we are today with 45,000 sealed indictments and a list of resignations and people no longer seeking re-election. The number of pedophiles that are being taken down. It's really like a lot of real world things are occurring in reference to this operation. But it's so important to understand what led up to this, how much work and momentum had to build for us to get here. And that can translate into full disclosure as well. There's work we can do to be more prepared, to be more informed, to be more tactical. So I think there's a really interesting lesson in connecting full disclosure and the narrow scope of the Q operation.